What happens when a man who has bankrupted casinos, failed universities, and collapsed luxury brands decides to take control of one of America's most sacred cultural institutions? The answer may be unfolding right now before our eyes. The John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, a place built to honor a fallen president and protect the soul of American art, is now facing something it has never faced before: political takeover, mass resignations, canceled performances, and a shutdown announced under the banner of revitalization. But critics say this is not renovation. They say this is destruction. And once again, the name at the center of the storm is Donald Trump. For more than 50 years, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts stood as a bipartisan monument to creativity. Founded in the Eisenhower era, named after President Kennedy, and opened during the Nixon administration, it was meant to be above politics. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all were welcome. Artists came not as partisans, but as storytellers. The Kennedy Center survived wars, protests, cultural revolutions, and even the COVID pandemic. The only time its doors closed before was briefly during lockdown. It never collapsed from controversy. It never needed to be rescued. It worked. It was profitable. It was respected. Then everything changed. When Trump loyalist Richard Grenell was installed as chairman and longtime board members were removed, the reaction from the arts community was swift and brutal. Performers began canceling, administrators resigned, entire organizations pulled out. Within days, what had been a thriving cultural ecosystem started to unravel, and suddenly Trump announced something no one expected. The Kennedy Center would shut down for approximately 2 years for reconstruction and revitalization. But here's the problem. Institutions that are healthy do not suddenly need to be shut down for years. Museums don't close for ideology. Opera houses don't collapse because of renovation. And thriving venues do not hemorrhage artists overnight unless something has gone deeply wrong. Let's talk about what actually happened. World-renowned soprano Renee Fleming withdrew from her scheduled performances. Composer Philip Glass canceled the premiere of his Lincoln Symphony, stating clearly that the values of the Kennedy Center's new leadership conflicted with the message of his work. The Washington National Opera, which had performed there continuously since 1971, pulled out entirely. Ben Folds resigned as artistic advisor to the National Symphony Orchestra. Dance companies, children's theaters, quartets, and cultural organizations followed one after another. Even the U.S. Marine Band canceled participation in diversity-based programming. This wasn't coincidence. This was collapse. And Trump's response? He claimed the shutdown would make the center the finest performing arts facility in the world. He argued that performances interfered with construction, that the building must close so greatness could rise again. But critics immediately asked the obvious question: if this is about construction, who is paying? Who approved this? And why does every major artist seem to be running away? More troubling was Trump's decision to rename the Kennedy Center after himself, something only Congress has the authority to do. For many Americans, this crossed a symbolic line. The building is not just a theater. It is a memorial to President John F. Kennedy, assassinated in 1963. Renaming it was not branding. It was rewriting history. And to many, it felt like vandalism disguised as renovation. This is where pattern matters. Trump has a long record of attaching his name to institutions and watching them fail. Trump Vodka, Trump University, Trump Steaks, Trump Airlines, Trump Casinos, Trump Magazine, Trump Modeling Agency, Trump Mortgages. Each began with confidence and collapsed into lawsuits, bankruptcy, or obscurity. The pattern is simple: ego first, management second, consequences later. And now that pattern appears to have reached America's most important cultural stage. What makes this moment especially dangerous is not just financial damage, it is cultural damage. The Kennedy Center was one of the last spaces where art lived outside of politics. Ballet, opera, jazz, children's theater, orchestral music, all under one roof. By politicizing the institution, by purging leadership, and by forcing ideological loyalty, something fundamental broke. Artists do not thrive under intimidation. Creativity does not grow under control. History shows this again and again. When governments take over art, art becomes propaganda. And when propaganda replaces expression, culture dies. Ben Folds said it best when he described this as an authoritarian first step. Not by silencing comedians or journalists first, but by targeting artists. Because art is easier to crush quietly. There are no elections in symphonies, no protests in violin sections. You dismantle culture before you dismantle criticism. Supporters of Trump say this is just business, that the Kennedy Center needed change, that resistance from artists proves bias. But this argument ignores reality. The center was functioning, it was respected, it was solvent, it was internationally admired. The crisis did not come from art, it came from politics. And here's the irony. Trump claims to be making it greater than ever, yet every sign points in the opposite direction. A building without performers is just concrete. A theater without artists is a monument to silence. And a memorial without integrity is no longer a memorial. The Kennedy Center did not die from lack of funding. It did not die from lack of audiences. It did not die from lack of purpose. It is being suffocated by ego. So the question now is not whether the Kennedy Center will reopen in 2 years. The real question is whether it will still be the Kennedy Center when it does, whether it will be a home for artists or a showroom for political vanity, whether it will honor John F. Kennedy or Donald Trump, whether culture can survive being turned into a brand. History is watching this moment, and history will remember whether America protected its art or allowed it to be renamed, reshaped, and reduced into another failed Trump project. Because when the music stops, when the curtains stay closed, and when the artists walk away, what remains is not renovation. What remains is ruin. And once culture is lost, it is far harder to rebuild than any building ever could be. To understand what is happening now, you have to look backward. This story did not begin with the Kennedy Center. It began decades ago with a pattern that has repeated itself over and over again. Attach a famous name, promise greatness, demand loyalty, ignore expertise, and then blame everyone else when it collapses. The name at the center of this pattern is Donald Trump. His business history is not one of quiet competence. It is one of spectacle followed by failure. Casinos that went bankrupt, universities shut down after fraud lawsuits, luxury products that vanished from shelves. Each time, the branding was loud, the promises were huge, and the outcome was the same. And now, critics say, that same formula has been applied to a cultural institution that was never meant to be a brand at all. The John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts was created as a national space, not a personal empire. It was meant to be protected from ideology, not absorbed into it. For more than half a century, the center's leadership came from the arts world, people who understood programming, fundraising, community engagement, and the delicate balance between tradition and experimentation. That changed when Trump allies replaced experienced administrators with political loyalists who had little to no background in arts management. This wasn't reform, it was a purge. When Deborah Rutter and David Rubenstein were removed, the message was clear. Expertise no longer mattered. What mattered was allegiance. An artist noticed immediately. The exodus that followed wasn't coordinated, but it was unmistakable. Renee Fleming did not cancel quietly. Philip Glass did not withdraw diplomatically. Organizations did not simply reschedule. They walked away with statements explaining why. This is important. They didn't say the building was unsafe. They didn't say the acoustics were bad. They said the values had changed. That is the heart of this crisis. Institutions are not just buildings. They are identities. And when you change the identity, you change who feels welcome inside. Trump framed the shutdown as a bold rebuilding project. He said closing the Kennedy Center would allow for faster construction, higher quality results, and a grand reopening that would surpass anything before it. On paper, this sounds reasonable. But in reality, it raised serious questions. Why now? Why after mass resignations? Why after cancellations? Why when the center had already survived renovations in the past without shutting down entirely? And most importantly, who approved this? Legally, the Kennedy Center is overseen by a board and funded in part by Congress. It is not a private company. It cannot simply be renamed or closed at the will of one man. And yet, Trump announced decisions as if it were another Trump Tower or Trump Hotel. This blurred line between public institution and personal authority is what alarms so many critics. Because when a memorial becomes a marketing tool, something fundamental is broken. Then came the symbolism, the renaming, calling it the Trump Kennedy Center. This was not just a branding choice, it was a cultural statement. The building honors President John F. Kennedy, assassinated in 1963. It was created as a memorial to his belief that art and democracy belong together. Changing that name without congressional approval was not only controversial, it was perceived as disrespectful. For many Americans, this crossed into desecration. You don't rename Arlington Cemetery, you don't rename the Lincoln Memorial, and you don't rename the Kennedy Center. And yet Trump did what he has always done, doubled down. Supporters argued that artists were overreacting, that cancellations were politically motivated, that this was just liberal outrage. But that argument collapses under scrutiny. The Kennedy Center had always hosted artists from every political background. It had survived conservative presidents and liberal presidents alike. What it had never survived before was being turned into a political trophy. Look at the Washington National Opera. They had performed there since 1971, over 50 years of continuity. They left, not because of budget, not because of scheduling, but because the institution no longer aligned with their mission. That should terrify anyone who cares about culture. When organizations with half a century of loyalty walk away, the problem is not them. The problem is the system. The financial consequences are already visible. Canceled shows mean refunded tickets. Empty halls mean lost revenue. Sponsors become cautious. Donors hesitate. Tourism declines. This is how collapse looks in slow motion, not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a steady bleeding of trust. Trump's promise of a grand reopening ignores the fact that audiences follow artists, not buildings. If the artists don't come back, the building is just marble and seats. And here is the deeper danger: precedent. If one administration can take over a cultural institution and reshape it ideologically, then any administration can. Today it is the Kennedy Center. Tomorrow it could be museums, libraries, universities. Once art becomes subject to political loyalty tests, creativity becomes conditional. History has shown this in authoritarian states again and again. Control the culture and you control the narrative. Silence the artists and dissent weakens. Ben Folds warned that this was the first step, not the last. Artists are often the early warning system of democracy. They sense danger before politicians do. They leave before laws change, and when they do, it is rarely about ego, it is about survival. Trump's defenders say this is about making the center great again. But greatness in art is not measured in gold letters on a building. It is measured in trust, in freedom, in the courage to stage works that challenge power, not flatter it. The Lincoln Symphony was canceled precisely because it celebrated values now seen as inconvenient. That should worry every American, regardless of party. What we are witnessing is not renovation, it is redefinition. The Kennedy Center is being transformed from a shared cultural space into a political monument, and monuments that serve one man do not serve a nation. The saddest part is that this did not need to happen. The center was not broken. It was not failing. It was not in crisis. The crisis was introduced, and now Trump presents himself as the solution to the problem he created. This is a familiar strategy. Cause instability, then offer control as salvation. Create chaos, then call it leadership. Brand destruction as progress. So what happens next? If the Kennedy Center remains closed for 2 years or more, an entire generation of artists will grow elsewhere. New venues will rise. Audiences will form new habits. And when the doors finally reopen, the world may have moved on. Institutions do not freeze in time. They either adapt organically or decay artificially. The question now is not whether Trump can rebuild a building. The question is whether trust can be rebuilt, whether artists will return, whether donors will forgive, whether the Kennedy Center can again belong to everyone. Because once an institution becomes a symbol of division, it loses its soul. And when the music finally returns, the silence before it will always be remembered as the moment America allowed politics to swallow its culture. To understand why so many artists reacted so strongly, you have to look at history. Whenever political power tries to control art, culture is the first casualty. From authoritarian governments in the 20th century to modern regimes that silence filmmakers and musicians, the pattern is always the same. Creativity is allowed only if it flatters those in charge. What is happening at the Kennedy Center feels uncomfortably close to that pattern. When Donald Trump replaced experienced arts administrators with political loyalists, he didn't just change management, he changed the meaning of the institution. The Kennedy Center was no longer a neutral space for expression. It became a stage for power. Artists understand this instinctively. That is why so many walked away. Philip Glass didn't cancel because of money. Renee Fleming didn't withdraw because of scheduling conflicts. They left because the values of the institution no longer matched the values of their work. Art is not decoration, it is communication. And when an institution starts sending a political message instead of protecting creative freedom, artists refuse to become part of it. Financially, the consequences are already visible. Canceled concerts mean millions in lost revenue. Corporate sponsors become nervous about controversy. Donors who once gave out of love for the arts hesitate when the institution becomes politicized. Tourism suffers. Restaurants and local businesses feel the impact. This is how cultural collapse spreads outward from one building to an entire ecosystem. The Kennedy Center was not just a theater, it was an engine of artistic and economic life in Washington, D.C. There is also a legal and constitutional dimension. The Kennedy Center is a memorial, not a private company. It was created by Congress and funded by taxpayers. Renaming it and shutting it down without broad public consent raises serious questions about authority and overreach. Many legal scholars argue that such actions require congressional approval, not presidential branding. When a public monument becomes a personal symbol, it undermines the idea that national institutions belong to the people. Public reaction has been intense. Protests have appeared outside the center. Former board members have spoken out. Journalists and cultural critics warn that this sets a dangerous precedent. If one president can reshape a cultural institution in his own image, then every future president can do the same. Today, it is the Kennedy Center. Tomorrow, it could be museums, libraries, or universities. Once art becomes a tool of ideology, freedom of expression becomes conditional. Trump insists that closing the center is about renovation and making it the best in the world. But renovation does not require mass resignations. Renovation does not drive away half the artistic community. Renovation does not come after purging leadership and canceling programs focused on diversity and inclusion. These are not construction problems. These are trust problems. The future of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts now hangs in uncertainty. Even if the building reopens in 2 years, the cultural damage may last far longer. Artists will remember how they were treated. Audiences will remember the silence. And history will remember this moment as the time when politics tried to swallow art. Because buildings can be rebuilt. But once freedom leaves the stage, it is far harder to bring it back.